In the rain-slicked shadows of London's elite, Arthur Vane rules with iron and blood. But when the ruthless kingpin hires Elena, a woman drowning in her father's debts, to guard his silent nephew, a dangerous obsession is born. One night, the lines of duty vanish when Arthur appears in her room to claim what is his. Now caught between a syndicate war and a man who would burn the city to keep her, Elena must decide, is he her destruction or her only hope for survival? Some secrets are written in ink, but the Vane legacy is written in blood. May 14th, 2021. The iron gates of the estate groaned as they swung open, a sound that resonated deep within Elena's chest like a funeral knell. She clutched the strap of her worn leather bag, her knuckles white against the dark material. The taxi had dropped her at the end of the long, winding driveway, the driver refusing to get any closer to the property that the locals spoke of only in hushed, fearful tones. To them, this was a place where shadows had teeth. To Elena, it was a final, desperate prayer for survival. As she walked, the towering Victorian manor emerged from the London mist like a monolith of grey stone and jagged gables. It was beautiful in a way that felt predatory. The architecture was sharp, unforgiving, and draped in ivy that looked like skeletal fingers clawing at the walls. The air here was colder than in the city, carrying the scent of damp earth and ancient wood. She was 24 years old, and her life had already been narrowed down to this single, intimidating path. 3 months ago, the debt collectors had taken the last of her father's furniture. 1 month ago, they had taken the door off its hinges. Her father had been a man of many vices, but his love for the high-stakes tables of underground clubs had been the one that finally killed him, leaving Elena with a legacy of threats and a debt that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. She reached the massive oak front door and took a breath. Her reflection in the polished brass knocker showed a woman who looked far more composed than she felt. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight, professional bun, emphasizing the sharp line of her jaw and the hollows of her collarbones. She was slender, almost fragile, but there was a fire in her hazel eyes that years of hardship hadn't managed to extinguish. She knocked 3 times. The sound was swallowed by the vastness of the house. The door was opened not by a maid or a butler, but by a man who seemed to command the very air around him. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that filled the frame of the doorway. He wore a black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing thick wrists and a glimpse of ink, the tail of a dragon or perhaps a serpent, disappearing under his cuff. His hair was dark, cropped short, and his face was a map of hard lines and calculated indifference. This was Arthur Vane. "You're late," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in Elena's marrow. "The train was delayed and the taxi driver wouldn't come past the gate," Elena replied, her voice steadier than she expected. She didn't apologize. She knew instinctively that a man like Arthur Vane didn't value apologies. He valued results. He stepped back, gesturing for her to enter. As she passed him, the heat radiating from his body hit her like a physical wave. He smelled of expensive cedarwood, tobacco, and something metallic that she couldn't quite place. The foyer was grand, with a sweeping marble staircase and a chandelier that looked like a frozen explosion of crystal. Despite the opulence, there were no photographs, no flowers, no signs of a life lived with joy. "The agency said you were the best with difficult cases," Arthur said, leaning against a heavy mahogany table. He crossed his arms, his biceps straining against the fabric of his shirt. His eyes, a piercing icy blue, scanned her with the clinical precision of a man deciding whether a weapon was worth buying. "My nephew, Leo. He hasn't spoken a word since his parents were killed in December. Not to me, not to the doctors, not to the 3 nannies who came before you." "Trauma isn't a lock that can be picked with a single key, Mr. Vane," Elena said, meeting his gaze. "It requires patience and silence." Arthur moved closer. He didn't walk, he prowled. He stopped just inches from her, so close she could see the faint silver scar that sliced through his left eyebrow. The tension between them was immediate. A high-voltage wire stretched to the breaking point. She felt a sudden, traitorous flush of heat at the base of her neck. He was dangerous, a predator in a tailored cage, and every instinct she possessed told her to run. But she thought of the men waiting for her back in her cramped apartment, and she stood her ground. "I don't have patience, Elena," he whispered, his breath warm against her temple. "I have enemies, and I have a boy who is the only thing left of my blood. I need him whole again. If you can do that, your father's debts vanish. I've already bought them from the vultures who were circling you." Elena's heart skipped a beat. "You knew?" "I know everything about the people I bring into my home," he said, his hand reaching out. He didn't touch her, but his fingers hovered just an inch from her cheek, the proximity causing the fine hairs on her arms to stand up. "I know you're desperate. I know you're smart. And I know you have nowhere else to go." He dropped his hand, the spell breaking as he turned toward the stairs. "Come, I'll show you to the boy, then we will discuss the rules of this house. There are many, and I do not tolerate them being broken." Eleanor followed him, her eyes fixed on the broad expanse of his back. The house felt like it was closing in on her, the shadows in the corners stretching toward her feet. She had entered the lion's den to save herself from the wolves, but as she watched Arthur Vane move with lethal grace through the halls of his silent kingdom, she wondered if she had simply traded one kind of destruction for another. Upstairs, the air grew even stiller. Arthur stopped before a heavy door at the end of the long gallery. He didn't knock. He pushed it open to reveal a room filled with every toy a child could desire, yet it felt like a cell. In the center of a large navy blue rug sat a small boy, perhaps 6 years old. He was building a tower of wooden blocks with a focus that was unnerving for a child his age. "Leo," Arthur said, his voice softening only a fraction. The boy didn't look up. He didn't even flinch. He simply placed another block on the tower, his small hands trembling slightly. "He stays in this room unless I am with him," Arthur stated, turning back to Elena. His expression was once again unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, grief perhaps, deep in those blue eyes. "Your room is adjacent to his. There is a connecting door. You are to be with him at all times. My men handle the perimeter of the house. You handle the boy." "And what about you, Mr. Vane?" Elena asked, looking at the man who seemed to haunt his own home. Arthur stepped toward her again, cornering her against the doorframe. He placed a hand on the wood beside her head, his large frame casting a shadow that completely engulfed her. The smell of him was overwhelming now, intoxicating and terrifying all at once. "I am the ghost that keeps the monsters away," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble that made Elena's knees feel weak. "Do not go looking for me in the dark, Elena. You might not like what you find." He lingered for a second too long, his eyes dropping to her lips before he pushed off the doorframe and vanished into the hallway without another word. Elena stood there, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at Leo, then at the empty space where Arthur had been. The first night in the Vane Manor was just beginning, and the air was already thick with the promise of a storm that would leave no one unchanged. May 14th, 2021. The silence in the manor was not the peaceful quiet of a library. It was a heavy, suffocating thing that felt like it had weight and texture. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the floorboards, Elena found herself standing in the middle of her new quarters. The room was large and sparsely furnished with antiques that looked like they belonged in a museum. A four-poster bed dominated the space, its dark velvet curtains smelling faintly of lavender and dust. She walked to the connecting door and pushed it open an inch. Leo was still there, sitting exactly where Arthur had left him. The boy hadn't moved. He hadn't even reached for the glass of water on the small table nearby. It was heartbreaking to witness, a child so completely retreated into himself that the world outside no longer seemed to exist. Eleanor stepped into his room, her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't speak. Instead, she sat on the floor several feet away from him, mirroring his posture. She pulled a small sketchpad and a charcoal pencil from her bag. For 30 minutes, the only sound in the room was the rhythmic scritch-scratch of the charcoal against the paper. She didn't look at him directly, but she could feel him watching her out of the corner of his eye. "I like to draw when I'm nervous," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Sometimes words are too loud. They take up too much space." Leo's hand, which had been hovered over a red block, froze. He didn't speak, but he didn't move away either. It was a small victory, a hairline fracture in the wall he had built around his soul. Eventually, the darkness became too absolute to ignore. Eleanor stood up, her joints protesting from the hard floor, and guided Leo toward his bed. He moved like a sleepwalker, allowing her to tuck him in without resistance. As she pulled the heavy duvet over his small frame, she noticed a faint, jagged scar on the back of his neck, a permanent reminder of the night his world had ended. After ensuring the boy was asleep, Elena returned to her own room. She felt a desperate need to wash away the grime of the journey and the lingering tension of her encounter with Arthur. The bathroom was a masterpiece of marble and chrome, featuring a deep clawfoot tub that looked inviting. She stripped off her clothes, her skin prickling in the cool air, and stepped into the steaming water. She leaned back, closing her eyes, trying to silence the frantic thoughts in her head. But every time she drifted, she saw the icy blue of Arthur's eyes. She felt the ghost of his presence, the way he had loomed over her in the hallway, his power radiating in waves. She trailed a hand over her own shoulder, her fingers tracing the path his gaze had taken. The water felt like silk against her skin, but it couldn't soothe the strange, restless ache that had settled in her chest since she arrived. Wrapped in a thick white robe, she eventually emerged from the bathroom. The house felt different at night. The groans of the wood and the whistling of the wind through the eaves sounded like whispers. She realized she hadn't eaten since the morning, and the thought of navigating the dark hallways to find the kitchen was daunting. She opened her door and stepped into the gallery. The lights were dimmed to a low amber glow. As she walked toward the stairs, she heard the muffled sound of voices coming from the floor below. "I don't care about the risk, Tommy," a voice growled. It was Arthur. "The shipments stay on schedule. If the Italians think they can squeeze our margins just because we're down a few men, they'll learn otherwise by dawn." "They're watching the docks, boss," another voice replied, sounding strained. "Word is they've hired a specialist, someone from the north." "Let them watch," Arthur snapped. "I want the perimeter of the manor doubled. No one goes in or out without my express permission. And if I see a single paparazzi or rival scout within a mile of these gates, bury them." Elena retreated into the shadows, her heart hammering. The business the agency had alluded to was far more dangerous than she had imagined. She wasn't just a nanny, she was a guest in a fortress, living under the protection and the thumb of a man at war. She made her way back to her room, her hunger forgotten. She needed to lock the door. She needed to feel safe. But as she reached for the handle, she realized there was no lock on the inside. It had been removed. She stood there for a moment, her hand trembling on the cold metal. She felt exposed, a bird in a gilded cage that had no latches. She retreated to the bed and climbed under the covers, still wearing the robe for some semblance of protection. The hours crawled by. She listened to the distant sounds of the house, the closing of heavy doors, the low rumble of a car engine in the distance, the wind rattling the window panes. Sleep was a fickle friend, hovering just out of reach. She found herself thinking about her father. He would have loved this house. He would have seen the marble and the crystal and thought he had finally made it, ignoring the blood that surely paid for every inch of it. Eleanor, however, only saw the price. She saw the fear in Leo's eyes and the hardness in Arthur's heart. Around 1 in the morning, though she had lost all sense of time in the darkness, the door to her room creaked open. Elena sat up abruptly, clutching the duvet to her chest. The hallway light was a sharp blade across the floor, and in the doorway stood a silhouette that could only belong to one man. Arthur was still dressed in his black shirt, but it was unbuttoned halfway down, revealing the hard, muscular planes of his chest. He looked weary, the lines of his face deeper in the shadows, but his eyes were burning with an intensity that pinned her to the spot. He didn't say a word. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, plunging them into a heavy, intimate darkness. The silence between them stretched, thick with everything that hadn't been said. Eleanor could hear her own pulse thundering in her ears. She should have been terrified, and she was. But there was something else, a dark, magnetic pull that made it impossible to look away. Arthur walked toward the bed, his footsteps silent on the thick rug. He stopped at the edge, looming over her like a storm cloud. The scent of him, smoke, cedar, and raw power, filled her senses, making her head spin. "You're awake," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration in the quiet room. "I couldn't sleep," she whispered, her voice cracking. He sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress sinking under his weight. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. He reached out, his large hand moving slowly through the air until his knuckles brushed against the side of her neck, just above the collar of her robe. His skin was rough, calloused, and devastatingly warm. Eleanor's breath hitched in her throat. She should have moved away, should have screamed, but her body felt heavy, paralyzed by a sudden, overwhelming surge of electricity. "This house is full of ghosts, Elena," Arthur murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was firm, possessive, yet there was a strange, jagged tenderness to it that confused her more than the aggression ever could. "But tonight, you're the only thing that feels real." He leaned in, his face inches from hers. She could see the fire in his eyes, a hunger that went far beyond mere desire. It was the look of a man who had spent his whole life taking what he wanted, and right now, he wanted her. As his hand slid into the hair at the nape of her neck, pulling her gently toward him, Eleanor realized that the rules of the house were about to change forever. The nanny and the gangster were no longer separated by a contract. They were separated only by the thin fabric of her robe and the desperate racing beat of two hearts that knew they were playing with fire. May 15th, 2021. The darkness in the room felt thick enough to swallow them both, a heavy velvet curtain that shielded them from the judgment of the world outside. Elena's heart was no longer just a beat, it was a rhythmic thunder, echoing in the hollow of her throat. Arthur's hand remained anchored in her hair, his fingers slightly curled, maintaining a pressure that was both a tether and a command. "You should tell me to leave," Arthur murmured. His voice was so low, it was less a sound and more a vibration that traveled from his chest into hers. His face was a landscape of shadows, but his eyes caught the faint silver glint of the moon filtering through the heavy drapes. They were predatory, focused, and entirely devoid of apology. "Would you go if I did?" Elena whispered. Her voice felt fragile, like fine glass ready to shatter under the weight of the moment. Arthur didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned in closer, his nose brushing against the shell of her ear. "No," he confessed, the honesty of it more terrifying than any threat. "I've spent 3 decades taking what I want from this city, Eleanor, and right now, the city doesn't exist. Only this room, only you." He shifted his weight, the mattress groaning under the movement. His other hand found the belt of her robe, his knuckles grazing the silk of her skin through the opening. The contact sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity through her, a sensation so sharp it made her gasp. It wasn't just fear, it was a desperate, long-buried recognition of a fire she hadn't known she was capable of harboring. Elena reached out, her fingers trembling as they touched the hard, scarred expanse of his chest. His skin was burning, his heart beating with a slow, steady power that felt as ancient as the stones of the manor. Beneath her palms, she felt the ripple of muscle, the sheer physical force of a man who lived by the sword. He was everything she should abhor, a criminal, a ghost, a dealer in violence. Yet in the vacuum of the night, he was the only source of heat in a cold, lonely world. "You're shaking," he observed, his thumb tracing the frantic pulse in her neck. "I'm not afraid of you," she lied, her breath hitching as he pulled her closer, eliminating the last few inches of space between them. "You should be," he replied, his lips finally meeting the sensitive curve where her neck met her shoulder. He didn't kiss her so much as claim her, his teeth grazing her skin with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. "I am not a good man, Elena. I don't know how to be gentle. I only know how to possess." He moved with a sudden, fluid grace, his body pressing her down into the pillows. The weight of him was immense, grounding her even as her mind began to whirl. His hands were everywhere, mapping the curves of her waist, the line of her ribs, the soft slope of her hips. The robe was a nuisance, a thin barrier that he dispatched with a single, practiced tug. When his skin finally met hers without hindrance, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The contrast was startling, the roughness of his calloused palms against the cream-like softness of her inner thighs. Elena let out a low moan, her head falling back as she arched toward him, her fingers digging into the muscles of his back. She felt like she was drowning, but for the first time in years she didn't want to reach for the surface. Arthur's movements were methodical, driven by a hunger that seemed to have been building since the moment she stepped through those iron gates. He explored her with a focused intensity, his mouth finding the hollow of her throat, the swell of her breasts, the sensitive skin of her stomach. Every touch was a signature, a marking of territory that left her breathless and reeling. The air in the room grew stifling, charged with the scent of their combined heat, salt, cedar, and the musk of raw desire. There was no gentleness here, no soft words of comfort. It was a collision of two desperate souls, one seeking a momentary escape from the blood on his hands, the other seeking a reason to feel alive amidst the wreckage of her life. As he moved over her, his eyes never left hers. Even in the dim light, the blue of his irises seemed to glow with a fierce, possessive flame. He took her with a raw, primal energy that demanded everything she had to give. It was intense, a physical conversation that bypassed logic and morality, speaking directly to the darkest parts of her heart. Elena gripped his shoulders, her nails leaving crescents in his skin as the tension within her reached a breaking point. The world narrowed down to the sensation of him, the sound of his ragged breathing, and the overwhelming power of his presence. When the crest finally broke, it was like an explosion of light behind her eyelids, a shattering of the silence that left her trembling and spent. Afterward, the room returned to its heavy, suffocating quiet. Arthur didn't pull away. He stayed draped over her for a long time, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling in the dark. The predatory edge had softened, replaced by a heavy, somber exhaustion. He eventually rolled onto his side, pulling her into the crook of his arm. It was a gesture of protection that felt jarringly at odds with the violence of his reputation. Elena rested her head on his chest, listening to the slowing rhythm of his heart. She felt marked, changed in a way that she couldn't yet articulate. "Sleep," he commanded softly, his hand resting heavily on her hip. "Will you be here in the morning?" she asked, her voice small and muffled against his skin. Arthur didn't answer. He simply tightened his grip, a silent acknowledgement that the morning was a lifetime away, and that for now, the darkness was their only master. Elena closed her eyes, her body humming with the aftershocks of the night. She knew that by dawn, the reality of her situation would return with a vengeance. She was still the nanny, and he was still the man who held her father's debts in his blood-stained hands. But as she drifted into a fitful sleep, she realized that the cage had not just been locked, it had been electrified. Outside, the London wind continued to howl against the Victorian stone, a lonely sound that echoed the secrets buried within the walls. In the room next door, the boy remained lost in his silent dreams, unaware that the two adults who held his fate in their hands had just forged a bond in the shadows that would either be their salvation or their ultimate undoing. The first night was over, but the fire had only just begun to spread. May 16th, 2021. The grey London morning light bled through the gaps in the heavy velvet curtains, cutting across the room like a cold, impartial blade. Elena woke slowly, her body feeling heavy and foreign, a map of sensations that hadn't existed 24 hours ago. The space beside her was empty, the sheets cold, but the scent of cedar and smoke lingered in the fabric, a silent witness to the storm that had passed through the room. She sat up, clutching the duvet to her chest, her eyes scanning the quiet room. For a moment she wondered if it had all been a fever dream brought on by the crushing weight of her debts and the oppressive atmosphere of the manor. But the ache in her limbs and the faint dark bruise blooming on her collarbone told a different story. The line hadn't just been crossed, it had been incinerated. She stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtains back. Outside, the mist was thick, clinging to the skeletal trees like a shroud. Far below, she saw two men in dark suits walking the perimeter, their hands tucked into their coats. This wasn't a home, it was a fortress, and she was now part of its internal architecture. After a quick cold shower that failed to wash away the memory of Arthur's hands, Eleanor dressed in a simple high-necked grey sweater and dark trousers. She needed to see Leo. She needed to return to the version of herself that was a professional, a woman with a purpose that didn't involve the man who owned the house. She found the boy in the breakfast nook, a sun-drenched space that felt strangely cheerful compared to the rest of the manor. He was staring at a bowl of oatmeal, his small face pale and unreadable. A housekeeper she hadn't met yet was moving silently in the background, placing a silver tray on the table. "Good morning, Leo," Elena said, her voice soft. The boy looked up, and for a fleeting second Elena saw a spark of recognition, perhaps even relief, in his eyes, before he looked back down at his food. "I'm not hungry," a voice rumbled from the doorway. Elena froze. Arthur was standing there, leaning against the frame. He looked entirely different than he had in the darkness. He was dressed in a sharp three-piece charcoal suit, his white shirt pristine, his tie knotted with lethal precision. He looked like a CEO, a titan of industry, but the cold hardness in his blue eyes reminded her that he was a man who commanded through fear, not board meetings. He didn't look at Leo. He looked directly at Eleanor. "The boy needs to eat," Arthur said, his tone devoid of the intimacy from the night before. "And you and I need to speak. My office, 10 minutes. He turned and vanished before she could respond. Eleanor felt a sharp pang of anxiety. The shift in his demeanor was jarring. In the dark, he had been a man seeking warmth. In the light, he was a king protecting his crown. After ensuring Leo ate at least a few spoonfuls of his breakfast, Elena made her way to the ground floor. She found the office behind a pair of heavy, soundproofed doors. The room was lined with leather-bound books and smelled of old paper and expensive whiskey. Arthur was sitting behind a massive oak desk, reviewing a stack of documents. "Sit," he commanded, not looking up. Eleanor sat in the high-backed leather chair opposite him. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. "Last night was a mistake of proximity," Arthur said finally, dropping his pen and leaning back. He fixed her with a gaze that felt like a physical weight. "I am a man of appetites, Elena, and you are a woman of considerable beauty who happened to be in the wrong place at the right time." The words stung more than they should have. Elena felt a flush of anger rise in her cheeks. "If you're looking for an apology, Mr. Vane, you won't get one from me. You were the one who entered my room." A ghost of a smirk played on his lips. "I don't want an apology. I want clarity. My life is not a romance, it is a war. The men who want me dead would use you as a bargaining chip the moment they realized you were more than a servant. If you stay in this house, you stay as my property. You stay as an anchor for that boy, and as a secret for me." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "Or I can give you £10,000 right now. I'll clear your father's debts entirely, and you can walk out those gates and never look back. You'll be free of the Vanes, free of the debt, and free of me." Eleanor stared at him. It was the escape she had prayed for. Total freedom. No more hiding from collectors, no more fear of the dark. She could start over, far away from London. "Why the choice?" she asked. "Because the boy likes you," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave. "And because I found myself thinking about you during a meeting this morning where I should have been thinking about the Italians. You're a distraction I can't afford, but you're a necessity I can't ignore." Elena thought of Leo's silent, trembling hands. She thought of the way Arthur had looked in the moonlight, haunted and broken. She thought of the electricity that had surged through her when he touched her, a feeling she knew she would never find in a normal life. "If I stay," Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength, "it's not as your property. I am Leo's teacher. I am his protector. And if you want me in your bed, it will be because I choose to be there, not because you bought me." Arthur's eyes narrowed. He stood up and walked around the desk, stopping just in front of her. He reached down, his fingers gripping her chin and tilting her face up to his. The heat was back, instantaneous and overwhelming. "You have a lot of pride for someone with nothing," he murmured. "I have my soul," she countered, "and right now, I'm the only one in this house who isn't afraid to look you in the eye." Arthur stared at her for a long time, the silence in the office becoming deafening. Finally, he released her chin. "The contract is rewritten then," he said. "You stay, but remember this, Elena. Once you choose to stay in the shadow of a man like me, the light never looks the same again. You won't just be watching the boy. You'll be watching the door. I've been watching the door my whole life, Elena replied, standing up to face him. At least here, I know who's on the other side of it. Arthur nodded slowly. Get back to the boy. We have guests arriving for dinner tonight. Business associates. You will be by Leo's side the entire time. Do not speak unless spoken to, and do not let him out of your sight. As Elena walked toward the door, she felt the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. She had chosen the cage. She had chosen the monster. As she stepped back into the hallway, she realized that the morning after wasn't the end of the encounter. It was the beginning of a life where every breath was a gamble. She reached the stairs and looked back. Arthur was still standing by his desk, watching her. In that moment, she knew she wasn't just staying for the boy. She was staying for the man who had claimed her in the dark, and for the dangerous, intoxicating power that now bound them together in a web of silk and steel. May the 16th, 2021. The manor underwent a transformation as the afternoon faded into a bruised purple twilight. The silent, empty hallways were suddenly populated by men in sharp suits who moved with the quiet efficiency of soldiers. They weren't the usual household staff. These were Arthur's inner circle, men with hard eyes and hidden holsters. The atmosphere grew thick with an unspoken anticipation, a heavy blanket of tension that made the hair on Elena's arms stand up. She spent the better part of the day in the nursery with Leo. The boy had started to respond to her presence, not with words but with small tentative gestures. He had allowed her to sit beside him while he looked through a book of anatomical sketches of birds. A strange choice for a 6-year-old, but perhaps the precision of the drawings offered him a sense of order in a world that had become chaotic and cruel. Around 5 in the evening, a knock sounded at the door. It wasn't the aggressive summons of Arthur, but a softer, more rhythmic beat. "Come in," Elena said. A woman entered carrying a garment bag. She was middle-aged with silver-streaked hair and a face that looked like it had seen every secret the Vane family had ever buried. "Mr. Vane sent this for you," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of emotion. "You are to be ready by 7. He expects punctuality." When the woman left, Eleanor unzipped the bag. Inside was a dress of deep emerald silk, the fabric so fine it felt like liquid in her hands. It was elegant, high-necked but sleeveless, designed to cling to the body without being overtly provocative. Beside it was a pair of black velvet heels and a small box containing a single strand of pearls. She dressed in silence, the silk sliding over her skin like a cool caress. As she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Gone was the desperate girl drowning in debt. In her place stood a woman who looked like she belonged in this fortress of secrets. She left her hair down, the dark waves falling over her shoulders, a stark contrast to the vivid green of the dress. She guided Leo, who was dressed in a miniature version of a suit, down to the formal dining room. The table was set for 10, the silver and crystal gleaming under the soft glow of the chandelier. Arthur was already there, standing at the head of the table. He was nursing a glass of amber liquid, his gaze fixed on the dark window. When he turned, his breath hitched almost imperceptibly. His eyes traveled from the top of Elena's head down to the tips of her shoes, a slow, predatory appraisal that made her heart race. "The green suits you," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "It matches the fire in your eyes." "Who are these people, Arthur?" she asked, ignoring the compliment. Arthur walked toward her, his footsteps heavy on the polished floor. He stopped close enough that she could smell the whiskey and the cedarwood. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the pearls at her throat. The heat of his hand was a stark contrast to the cool gems. "They are the vultures," he whispered, leaning down so his lips were inches from her ear. "Men who think they can take what is mine because they believe I have grown soft. Tonight, we show them that the Vane name still carries a price." He looked down at Leo, who was clutching Elena's hand. For a second, the mask slipped. Elena saw a flicker of raw, unadulterated pain in Arthur's eyes, the look of a man who was desperately trying to protect a flame in the middle of a hurricane. "My brother, Leo's father, was the diplomat of this family," Arthur said, his voice tight. "He thought he could negotiate with the Moretti syndicate. He thought there was honor among thieves. They killed him and his wife in front of this boy to send a message. They thought they could break me by taking the only people I loved. He gripped Elena's shoulder, his fingers digging slightly into the silk. They failed, but they are still watching. They want the boy because he is the heir to everything. And they want me dead so they can carve up London like a Sunday roast. Is that why you're so hard? Elena asked, her voice softening. Because you're afraid? Arthur's grip tightened for a moment before he let go. He let out a short, harsh laugh. Fear is a luxury I lost a long time ago, Elena. What you see is the only version of me that can keep that boy alive. If I am a monster, it is because I have to fight the ones at the gate. The sound of car engines outside signaled the arrival of the guests. Arthur's expression flattened into a cold, impenetrable mask. He reached out and took Leo's hand, the small fingers disappearing inside his massive palm. Stay close to him, Arthur commanded, and stay close to me. Do not let anyone pull you away from the table. The dinner was an exercise in psychological warfare. The Moretti representatives were polished, their smiles as sharp as razors. They spoke in coded language, discussing territories and shipping lanes as if they were talking about weather patterns. Eleanor sat in silence, her hand resting on Leo's shoulder, feeling the boy's slight tremors. Every time one of the men looked at her with a lingering, oily gaze, she felt Arthur's presence sharpen. He didn't speak much, but the way he held his knife, the way he watched every movement across the table, was a constant threat. Midway through the meal, the man sitting across from Elena, a slick individual with a gold watch and a cruel mouth, leaned forward. You found a beautiful addition to your staff, Vane. She has a certain elegance. Perhaps we could discuss a trade. I have a villa in Tuscany that needs a woman of her caliber. The room went deathly silent. The only sound was the clicking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Arthur didn't roar. He didn't slam the table. He slowly lowered his fork and looked the man in the eye. My staff is not for trade, Luca. And the next time you look at her like that, I'll make sure you never look at anything again. The man blanched, the smile sliding off his face. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like it could be sliced with a blade. Arthur turned to Eleanor, his gaze softening just a fraction, a silent check to see if she was all right. After the guests finally departed, leaving a trail of expensive cologne and unspoken threats in their wake, the manor returned to its haunted quiet. Arthur stood by the fireplace, watching the embers die out. Elena had put Leo to bed and returned to the dining room, drawn back to the man who had defended her with such terrifying quietude. You didn't have to do that, she said, standing in the doorway. Yes, I did, Arthur replied without turning around. I told you, you are under my protection. That includes the way men speak to you. He turned, and the exhaustion she had seen the night before was back, more profound than ever. He walked toward her, his movements slow. When he reached her, he didn't stop until their bodies were inches apart. He reached out, his hands framing her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. I am a violent man, Elena, he whispered, his voice cracking. But when I look at you, I remember what it feels like to want something that isn't made of blood and stone. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. The vulnerability in the gesture was more intimate than the passion of the night before. Eleanor reached up, her fingers tangling in the dark hair at the nape of his neck. She could feel the heat of him, the desperate racing pulse of a man who was always on the edge of an abyss. As he tilted her head back, his lips hovering just a hair's breadth from hers, Eleanor realized that she wasn't just learning the lessons of the darkness. She was becoming a part of it. The man before her was a monster to the world, but to her, he was a man holding on to the last shreds of his humanity with both hands. The kiss, when it finally came, was slow, deep, and tasted of whiskey and desperate hope. It was a promise made in the shadows, a bond that ensured that whatever happened next, they would face the ghosts together. But as the wind rattled the windows of the manor, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that the vultures were only getting hungrier. May 17th, 2021. The taste of whiskey and desperate hope lingered on Elena's lips, long after Arthur had retreated into the shadows of the hallway. She stood alone in the grand dining room, the silence of the manor pressing against her ears like a heavy tide. The embers in the fireplace gave one last defiant pop before fading into grey ash. She felt a strange vibrating energy beneath her skin, a mixture of terror and an exhilarating sense of belonging that she couldn't quite reconcile with her conscience. That night, sleep didn't come easily. When it finally did, it wasn't the peaceful rest of the innocent, but a vivid, jagged journey into the world she had fought so hard to leave behind. Flashback, November 12th, 2018. The apartment in East London had smelled of damp wallpaper and cheap gin. Elena, then 21, had been sitting at a cramped kitchen table trying to balance the books for her father's failing upholstery business. The radiator had been clanking, a rhythmic metallic heartbeat that seemed to count down the seconds to their ruin. Her father, Julian, had stumbled through the door, his coat torn, his eyes bloodshot and darting around the room like a trapped animal. He hadn't looked at her. He never looked at her when he had lost. "They're coming, Elena," he had whispered, his hands shaking so violently that he dropped his keys on the linoleum floor. "I thought the cards would turn. I had a king and a queen. I was so close." "How much, Dad?" she had asked, her voice flat, the soul-crushing fatigue of his addiction weighing her down. 10,000. Maybe 15, he'd stammered. "But it's not just the money this time. It's the men, the ones with the scarred knuckles. They said if I didn't have it by midnight, they'd take something else. They looked at your picture on the mantel, Elena." The memory of that night was a cold weight in her stomach. She remembered the sound of the front door being kicked off its hinges, a sharp splintering crack that ended her childhood forever. She remembered the two men who had stepped into their home, smelling of wet pavement and malice. They hadn't been polished like the Moretti syndicate. They were street-level thugs, the kind who enjoyed the sound of a person's spirit breaking. Julian had hidden behind her. Her father, the man who was supposed to be her shield, had used his daughter as a human barrier, trembling like a leaf in a gale. She had looked into the eyes of those men and realized that in their world, weakness was a death sentence. She had managed to talk them into a payment plan, a deal that cost her 3 years of her life working 3 jobs and selling every heirloom her mother had left behind. Present day, May 17th, 2021. Elena woke up in the oversized 4-poster bed, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The room was dark, the moonlight casting long, skeletal shadows across the velvet curtains. She sat up, her fingers digging into the silk sheets. She realized then, with a clarity that was both sobering and frightening, that she wasn't just in this manner to pay off a debt. She had been running from the memory of her father's trembling hands her entire life. Arthur Vane was a monster, yes. He was a dealer in violence and a master of the underworld, but he was steady. His hands didn't shake. When he looked at a threat, he didn't hide. He dismantled it. She wasn't just running from the debt. She was running toward the one thing her father could never provide: the absolute, terrifying security of a man who owned the darkness. A soft sound from the connecting door drew her attention. She stood and walked to Leo's room. The boy was sitting up in bed, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at the window. He was having a night terror, one of the silent kind where the scream is trapped behind a wall of trauma. Elena sat on the edge of his bed and pulled him into her lap. He was stiff at first, his small body vibrating with tension, but slowly he began to soften. She rocked him back and forth, humming a low, wordless tune. "You're safe, Leo," she whispered into his hair. "The monsters can't get in here. I won't let them, and neither will he." "He's already here," a voice said from the shadows near the door. Eleanor didn't jump. She had expected him. Arthur was leaning against the wardrobe, his silhouette imposing and dark. He was wearing a silk robe, his chest bare beneath it, the dragon tattoo on his arm appearing to writhe in the dim light. "He was having a nightmare," Elena said, not moving from her position with the boy. Arthur walked over and sat on the other side of the bed. The mattress dipped, and for a moment they were a strange, fractured image of a family. The nanny, the orphan, and the kingpin, all bound together by blood and secrets. Arthur reached out, his large hand resting on Leo's head for a brief, heavy second before he turned his gaze to Elena. "You were crying in your sleep," he said. It wasn't a question. It was an observation. "I was remembering my father," Elena replied, her voice steady. He was a gambler, a weak man who sold pieces of his soul until there was nothing left to lose. Arthur's eyes narrowed, searching her face. "And what do you see when you look at me, Elena? Another man selling his soul." Elena reached out, her hand finding Arthur's on the duvet. She interlaced her fingers with his, feeling the incredible strength in his grip. "No, I see a man who bought his soul back with a blade. I see someone who would never hide behind a woman." The temperature in the room seemed to rise. Arthur leaned in, his face inches from hers. The proximity was intoxicating, the scent of him acting like a drug on her senses. He looked down at their joined hands, then back at her. "I told you once not to go looking for me in the dark," he murmured. "But here you are holding my hand while the world burns outside." "Maybe I'm tired of being the only one holding the fire," she whispered. Arthur's thumb traced the line of her knuckles, a slow, deliberate movement that made her breath hitch. "The Morettis are planning something for the gala on June 3rd. It's a high-stakes game, Elena. They'll try to get to me through you. They saw the way I looked at you at dinner. They know you're my weakness now." "I'm not a weakness," Elena countered, her hazel eyes flashing. "I'm the only person in this house who can tell you the truth. If they want to use me, let them try. I've survived men much worse than them with far less than what I have now." Arthur leaned forward and pressed a lingering kiss to her forehead, a gesture so tender it felt like a brand. "I'll give you everything you need to survive them, Eleanor. Diamonds, silk, and a name that makes the bravest men in London tremble. But in return, I need you to be exactly who you are. Don't let this house turn you into a ghost." He stood up, looking down at her one last time. "Try to sleep. We have a lot of work to do before the 3rd. The city needs to be reminded who owns the night." As he walked out, Elena looked down at Leo, who had finally fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep. She realized that she had just made a second choice, one much deeper than the first. She wasn't just staying for the money or the safety. She was staying for the man who was willing to burn the city down just to keep her warm. The shadow of her past was still there, but for the first time in her life it was being eclipsed by a much larger, much darker shadow, and she found that she didn't want to step out of it. The loop was open. The gala was coming, and with it, the first real test of their dangerous alliance. Eleanor knew that by the time June 3rd arrived, she wouldn't just be the nanny anymore. She would be the queen of a kingdom built on blood, and she was ready to play her part. June 3rd, 2021. The transformation was total. Elena stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her suite, staring at a woman she didn't recognize. The dress Arthur had selected was a masterpiece of liquid obsidian silk that seemed to absorb the light of the room. It was backless, the fabric plunging to the small of her back, held together by two delicate platinum chains that glittered like stardust against her pale skin. It clung to her curves with a possessive intimacy, every movement causing the silk to ripple like dark water. On her vanity sat a velvet-lined box. Inside lay a necklace of black diamonds, rare and cold, their facets catching the amber glow of the lamps. As she fastened the clasp, the weight of the stones felt like a collar, a beautiful, expensive mark of ownership. She had painted her lips a deep, blood red, and her eyes were shadowed with kohl, making the hazel depths appear almost emerald. She heard the heavy tread of boots in the hallway. The door opened, and Arthur stepped inside. He was dressed in a bespoke black tuxedo, the tailoring so precise it highlighted the lethal breadth of his shoulders and the narrowing of his waist. He looked every bit the aristocrat, yet the way he moved, the way his eyes never stopped scanning the room, betrayed the predator beneath the wool and silk. He stopped directly behind her, his reflection looming over hers in the glass. He didn't speak for a long time. He simply watched her, his gaze traveling over the bare expanse of her back with a hunger that made the air in the room feel thin. "You look like a dream I don't deserve to have," he murmured, his voice a low, rough vibration. He reached out, his large, calloused hands resting on her bare shoulders. The temperature of his skin was staggering against her own. He leaned down, his lips brushing against the sensitive curve of her neck, just above the black diamonds. Eleanor closed her eyes, her breath hitching as a wave of heat rolled through her. "Tonight you are not a nanny," Arthur whispered, his hands sliding down her arms to grip her waist. He pulled her back against him, his hard frame an unyielding wall. You are the woman of the Vane house. Every man in that room will want to touch you. Every woman will want to be you. But you belong to the shadows, Elena. You belong to me." "Is that why you're wearing me like jewelry, Arthur?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "To show them what you've won?" Arthur turned her around in his arms, his grip firm but not unkind. He looked deep into her eyes, his expression a mixture of fierce protection and raw desire. "I'm wearing you because you are the only beautiful thing in a world full of filth, and because I want them to know that if they even think about reaching for you, I will burn London to the ground to stop them." They left the manor in a long black armoured limousine. The interior was a sanctuary of leather and mahogany, shielded from the outside world by tinted glass. As the car pulled away from the gates and merged into the rain-slicked streets of London, the silence between them became a living thing, charged with the electricity of the night. The city blurred past them, a kaleidoscope of neon lights, red buses, and the grey stone of the embankment. Inside the car, the only light came from the blue glow of the dashboard and the occasional flash of a street lamp. Arthur sat close to her, his thigh pressing against hers. The contact was a constant, burning reminder of his presence. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the line of her palm. The movement was slow, deliberate, and devastatingly sensual. Eleanor felt the tension building in her lower belly, a tight, aching knot of anticipation. "Are you nervous?" he asked, his eyes never leaving her face. "A little," she admitted. "I've never been to a place like this. Not as a guest." Arthur shifted, leaning closer until his face was inches from hers. The scent of him, expensive tobacco, aged scotch, and the raw musk of a man, filled the small space. He reached up, his fingers tangling in the dark waves of her hair, tilting her head back against the leather seat. "Stay close to my side," he commanded, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Don't take a drink from anyone but me. And if I tell you to move, you don't ask why, you just move." He didn't wait for her to answer. He pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was both a promise and an ultimatum. It tasted of the storm outside and the fire within. Elena responded with a desperation that surprised her, her hands finding the lapels of his jacket, pulling him closer until there was no space left between them. The car swerved slightly as it navigated a corner, throwing her more firmly against him. His hand slid from her hair down to the small of her back, his fingers tracing the dip of her spine where the dress ended. The touch was light, almost a tease, but it sent shivers racing across her skin. The confined space of the limousine felt like it was shrinking, the heat of their bodies creating a private world where the dangers of the gala seemed a million miles away. "Arthur," she breathed against his lips. "I know," he groaned, his forehead resting against hers, "but we have a war to win before we can lose ourselves." The car slowed as it approached a grand, neoclassical building in the heart of Mayfair. Even through the tinted glass, Eleanor could see the flash of cameras and the heavy presence of security teams. This was the Lion's Den, a gathering of the city's most powerful and most dangerous. The chauffeur opened the door, and the roar of the city flooded in. Arthur stepped out first, turning to offer his hand to Eleanor. As she stepped onto the red carpet, the flashbulbs erupted, a blinding white wall of light. Arthur leaned in, his arm sliding around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. "Keep your head up," he whispered. "You're a Vane tonight. Let them see the fire." As they walked toward the massive bronze doors of the venue, Elena felt the eyes of 100 people on her. She saw the Moretti lieutenants standing by the entrance, their gazes cold and calculating. She saw the whispers behind silk fans and the way men reached for their glasses as she passed. She was the prize, she was the target. And as she stepped into the grand ballroom, where the air was thick with the scent of lilies and betrayal, she realized that the game had officially begun. Arthur's grip on her waist tightened, a silent signal. Across the room, standing near a fountain of flowing champagne, was a man with grey hair and a face like a hawk. He raised a glass toward them, a mocking smile playing on his lips. "The game is afoot, Elena," Arthur murmured, his eyes locking onto his rival. "Don't look away." The loop was open. The gala was a battlefield, and every smile was a concealed blade. June 3rd, 2021. The ballroom was a sea of glittering hypocrisy. Beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Mayfair estate, the air was thick with the scent of lilies, expensive cigars, and the metallic tang of hidden agendas. Men in £6,000 suits toasted to partnerships, while their eyes searched for the quickest way to slide a knife into their neighbour's back. Elena walked beside Arthur, her hand resting on the crook of his arm. Through the fine wool of his tuxedo, she could feel the bunched muscle of his forearm, a coiled spring ready to snap. "Smile, Elena," Arthur murmured, his lips barely moving as they navigated the crowd. "In this room, a smile is a shield. If they see you're afraid, they'll smell blood." "I'm not afraid," she lied, though her heart was drumming against her ribs. She felt the weight of the black diamonds around her neck, a heavy reminder of the world she had stepped into. Every eye in the room followed them. She wasn't just a guest. She was a statement of Arthur Vane's dominance. The hawk-faced man they had seen earlier, Luca Moretti, intercepted them near the balcony doors. He was accompanied by two men whose bulk suggested they were more comfortable with lead pipes than champagne flutes. "Arthur," Luca said, his voice a smooth, oily rasp, "you've been making quite a stir lately. The docks, the shipping lanes, you're becoming very greedy. One might think you're trying to build an empire on your own." "I'm not building an empire, Luca," Arthur replied, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency. "I'm maintaining my property. There's a difference." Luca's gaze drifted to Elena, lingering on the plunging line of her dress and the bare skin of her shoulders. A slow, suggestive smirk spread across his face. "And this property? She's certainly more refined than the usual hired help. I hear she's quite good with children. Perhaps she could teach me a thing or two about discipline." Eleanor felt Arthur's entire body go rigid. The atmosphere around them shifted instantly, the temperature seemingly dropping 10 degrees. Arthur didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply took a step closer to Luca, his presence so overwhelming that the rival's bodyguards instinctively reached for their jackets. "You have 5 seconds to apologize for that remark," Arthur said, his blue eyes turning to ice, "before I decide that your tongue is a luxury you no longer need." Luca laughed, but it was a brittle, nervous sound. He looked around the crowded ballroom, confident that the presence of so many witnesses would protect him. "Come now, Arthur. We're all gentlemen here. Surely you wouldn't cause a scene over a simple compliment." "1," Arthur counted. "Think of the optics, Vane," Luca sneered, though he took a half-step back. 2. "Fine," Luca spat, his face flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and rage. "My apologies to the lady. I didn't realize you were so sensitive about your domestic staff." Arthur stared at him for a long, agonizing moment before nodding slowly. "Stay away from her, Luca. If I see you within 10 feet of her again, I won't use words." Arthur led Elena away, his grip on her waist possessive and tight. They moved toward the far end of the ballroom, where the French doors opened onto a sprawling stone terrace overlooking the dark, rain-soaked gardens. The air outside was cool and damp, a welcome relief from the stifling heat of the gala. "He was trying to provoke you," Elena whispered, her hands shaking as she leaned against the stone balustrade. "He succeeded," Arthur growled. He stood behind her, his heat radiating through her back. He reached around her, his large hands gripping the stone on either side of her, effectively pinning her against the rail. "Men like Luca don't understand respect, Eleanor. They only understand consequences." Before she could respond, the silence of the terrace was broken by the sharp, rhythmic clicking of heels on stone. A woman Elena hadn't seen before approached from the shadows. She was young, dressed in a red gown that looked like a splash of blood against the night. "Arthur, we have a problem," the woman said, her voice urgent. "The north exit. 3 of our men are down. It wasn't a mistake, it was a breach." Arthur's face transformed. The polished aristocrat vanished, replaced by the street-hardened kingpin. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed Elena's hand, his fingers bruisingly tight. "We're leaving, now." They moved through a service corridor, away from the music and the lights. The transition from glamour to grit was instantaneous. The hallway was narrow, lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs. At the end of the hall, near the heavy steel exit door, lay one of Arthur's men. He was slumped against the wall, a dark, spreading stain on his white shirt. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The reality of Arthur's life was no longer a story or a threat. It was lying on the floor in front of her. "Stay behind me," Arthur commanded, his voice a lethal whisper. He reached into the small of his back and pulled a sleek black handgun from a hidden holster. The movement was so fast, so practiced, that it was terrifying. Two men stepped out from behind a stack of industrial crates at the end of the alleyway outside. They were armed, their faces obscured by shadows. Without a word, the first man raised his weapon. Arthur didn't wait. He fired 3 times in rapid succession. The sounds were muffled by a silencer, soft mechanical puffs that stood in jarring contrast to the violence they delivered. The first man collapsed instantly. The second managed to fire a shot that whistled past Elena's ear, shattering a window behind her, before Arthur's final bullet found its mark. It was over in less than 10 seconds. Arthur stepped forward, his boots crunching on the glass. He checked the bodies with a cold, clinical efficiency. When he turned back to Elena, his face was splattered with a few drops of blood, dark rubies against his pale skin. He looked like a god of war, terrifying and magnificent in his brutality. Elena was frozen, her back pressed against the cold brick wall. She looked at the bodies, then at the man she had allowed into her bed. The gore on his hands was the true price of the diamonds around her neck. She should have been repulsed. She should have run into the night and never looked back. But as Arthur walked toward her, the gun still in his hand, his eyes burning with a fierce protective light, she felt a different kind of shock. It was a dark, magnetic pull, a recognition of the lengths this man would go to keep her safe. He stopped in front of her, his breathing heavy. He reached out with his free hand, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. He saw the way she looked at the blood on his cuff, the way her hazel eyes were wide with a mixture of horror and fascination. "I told you," he whispered, his voice jagged. "This is who I am. This is what it takes." Elena reached up, her fingers trembling as she touched the spot of blood on his cheek. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in, her forehead resting against his chest. She could hear his heart, a steady iron beat that refused to falter even in the face of death. "I know," she breathed, her voice a fragile vow in the dark alley. Arthur tucked the weapon away and pulled her into a crushing embrace. The scent of gunpowder and rain was overwhelming. He buried his face in her neck, his body vibrating with the adrenaline of the kill. "We need to go," he said, his voice regaining its command. "The car is around the corner. We can't stay here." As they hurried toward the waiting limousine, Elena looked back at the shadows of the gala. The music was still playing, the champagne was still flowing, and the monsters were still smiling. But as the door of the armored car closed, sealing them into the dark leather sanctuary, she realized she wasn't the nanny anymore. She was a witness. She was an accomplice. And as Arthur reached for her in the back seat, his hands still warm with the heat of the struggle, she realized she was utterly, irrevocably consumed. The loop was closing. The first breach had been sealed with blood, but the war for London had only just begun to bleed into the night. June 3rd, 2021. The interior of the armored limousine was a tomb of black leather and shattered nerves. Outside, the London rain lashed against the reinforced glass, a frantic, rhythmic drumming that seemed to mimic the frantic pace of Elena's heart. The city blurred into a streak of neon and grey, but inside the car the world had narrowed down to the scent of burnt cordite and the heavy, ragged breathing of the man sitting beside her. Arthur hadn't moved since he pulled her into the seat. He sat with his head leaned back against the headrest, his eyes closed, his large hands resting on his thighs. There was a smear of dark blood on his white cuff, a stark, violent contrast to the pristine silk. Elena watched the way his chest rose and fell, the sheer physical power of him slowly settling back into a state of controlled lethality. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a low, raspy vibration that seemed to grate against the silence. He didn't open his eyes. "No," Elena whispered. She looked down at her own hands. They were still trembling. "But you killed them." Arthur finally opened his eyes. They were cold, 2 shards of blue ice that had seen too much and felt even more. He reached out, his hand moving through the dim light of the cabin until his fingers brushed against the line of her jaw. His touch was electric, a jolt of heat that burned through her skin. "I did what was necessary to bring you back to the manor," he said. He leaned closer, his shadow engulfing her. "Do you want to leave, Elena? The gates are still behind us. I can have the driver stop right now." Elena looked into his eyes and saw the truth. He was giving her one last chance to run from the monster he was. But as she looked at the blood on his cuff and remembered the way he had stepped between her and the bullets, she realized the truth about herself. She didn't want the safety of the world outside. She wanted the dangerous, absolute protection of the man in front of her. "No," she said, her voice gaining a sudden, fierce strength. "I'm not going anywhere." Arthur's expression didn't change, but his grip on her chin tightened just a fraction. He pulled her toward him, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was less about affection and more about survival. It was a collision of teeth and tongues, a desperate exchange of heat that tasted of salt and adrenaline. Helena reached up, her fingers digging into the expensive wool of his tuxedo, pulling him closer until there was no air left between them. The car arrived at the manor 20 minutes later. The transition from the limousine to the grand foyer was a blur of shadows and heavy doors closing behind them. The house felt different tonight, more oppressive, yet more like a sanctuary. Arthur didn't lead her to the nursery or the dining room. He led her straight up the grand staircase, his hand anchored firmly in hers. When they reached his private quarters, a part of the house Elena had never seen, the air felt charged, as if a storm had been trapped within the four walls. The room was vast, dominated by a fireplace where a low fire still crackled, and a massive bed draped in charcoal silk. Arthur turned to her, his movements fluid and predatory. He reached for the platinum chains at the back of her dress, his fingers deft despite their size. As the obsidian silk slid down her body, pooling at her feet like a dark shadow, Elena felt a sudden, profound sense of exposure. But as Arthur's gaze traveled over her, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a prize that had been fought for and won. He stripped off his jacket and shirt, revealing the map of scars and ink that covered his torso. The dragon on his arm seemed to glow in the firelight. He stepped into her space, his hands framing her face, his thumbs tracing the curves of her lips. "You saw what I am tonight," he murmured, his breath warm against her forehead. "There is no hiding from it anymore." "I don't want to hide," she breathed. He lifted her easily, his strength effortless, and carried her to the bed. The silk sheets were cool against her skin, but the heat radiating from Arthur was overwhelming. He came down over her, his weight a grounding force that silenced the echoes of the gunshots in her mind. Their connection was visceral, a physical manifestation of the war they were both fighting. Every touch was an exploration, every kiss a vow. Arthur moved with a slow, deliberate intensity, his hands mapping her body with a possessiveness that left no room for doubt. The contact was detailed, the friction of his skin against hers creating a fever that burned away everything else, the debt, the Morettis, the fear. In the quiet of the room, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the rhythmic, desperate gasps of two people losing themselves in each other. It was a consumption, a total surrender to the dark, magnetic pull that had been building since the moment she first knocked on the manor's door. Hours later, the fire had burned down to a low amber glow. Arthur lay on his back, his breathing deep and steady in sleep. Elena lay beside him, her head resting on his chest, listening to the iron beat of his heart. She felt a strange, hollow peace, a sense that she had finally arrived exactly where she was meant to be, even if it was in the heart of a fortress built on blood. She couldn't sleep. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a restless curiosity. She gently disentangled herself from Arthur's arms and sat up. The room was filled with shadows, but a faint light caught her eye from behind a heavy velvet tapestry on the far wall. She stood and walked toward it, her bare feet silent on the thick rug. She pulled the tapestry aside, expecting a window or a closet. Instead, she found a narrow, recessed door made of dark metal. It wasn't locked. The door creaked open just a fraction, revealing a steep set of stone stairs leading downward into the very foundations of the manor. A cold draught wafted up, carrying the scent of old paper and something metallic. Elena looked back at the sleeping man on the bed, then at the dark staircase. The rules of the house were clear, but the secrets she had already uncovered were nothing compared to what lay beneath. She took the first step down, her heart beginning to hammer once again. As she descended into the silence, she had no idea that the most shocking discovery of all was waiting for her in the dark, a secret that would link her father's ruin to the very man who now held her soul in his hands. June 4th, 2021. The stone steps were cold, an unforgiving chill that seeped through the soles of Elena's bare feet and traveled up her spine. The air grew thinner and more damp with every step she took into the belly of the manor. The only light came from a series of dim, recessed bulbs along the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows that danced against the rough-hewn walls. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird, yet she felt a strange, icy calm. She was a woman who had already seen the devil's face. A few more shadows couldn't break her. At the bottom of the staircase, the passage opened into a room that looked more like a military command center than a basement. It was a stark departure from the Victorian opulence above. Steel filing cabinets lined the walls, and a large industrial desk sat in the center, cluttered with monitors and stacks of manila folders. The smell here was different. No cedar or whiskey, just the sterile scent of old paper, ozone, and cold metal. Elena walked toward the desk, her eyes scanning the labels on the folders. Most were marked with names she didn't recognize: shipping companies, rival syndicates, and lists of assets. But then, her gaze snagged on a drawer that had been left slightly ajar. The label read, Julian. Her breath hitched. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she pulled the drawer open. Inside was a single, thick dossier. She pulled it out and laid it on the desk. The first page was a photograph of her father, Julian, looking younger, his face not yet etched with the lines of desperation that had defined his final years. She began to flip through the pages. It wasn't just a record of debt. It was a surveillance log. There were dates going back 5 years. 2016, 2017, 2018. Every major event of her life was documented. Her graduation, her first job at the library, the night the debt collectors had kicked in their door. There were even photographs of her, candid shots of her walking through the London fog, sitting in a park, crying at her father's funeral. The realization hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Arthur hadn't found her father's debts after hiring her. He had been watching them for half a decade. The agency that had sent her here wasn't a stroke of luck. It was a carefully constructed trap. I told you not to go looking in the dark, Elena. The voice was low, steady, and came from the shadows of the staircase. Elena didn't jump. She felt a wave of cold fury wash over her, grounding her. She turned slowly to see Arthur standing at the base of the stairs. He was still half-dressed, his dark trousers slung low on his hips, his chest bare. In the harsh fluorescent light, the scars on his skin looked like silver, jagged lightning. He looked beautiful and terrible all at once. "You've been watching me for 5 years," she said, her voice a razor-edged whisper. She slammed the folder shut, the sound echoing in the small room. "The debt, the collectors, the agency, it was all you, wasn't it? You didn't save me, Arthur. You orchestrated my ruin so you could play the hero." Arthur didn't move. He didn't look guilty or even surprised. He walked toward her, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He stopped just on the other side of the desk, the industrial lamp casting a sharp light on the hard planes of his face. "I didn't cause your father's addiction, Elena," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Julian did that all on his own. He was a man who couldn't help but gamble away everything he loved. I simply ensured that when he finally fell, he fell into my hands instead of someone who would have sold you to the highest bidder in a Soho basement." "So I should thank you," she spat, her hazel eyes flashing with a dangerous fire. "For stalking me? For treating my life like a chess game?" Arthur reached across the desk, his hand moving slowly until his fingers brushed against the folder. "I needed a reason to bring you here. I needed a woman who was untainted by this world, yet strong enough to survive it. I needed someone Leo would trust and someone who could remind me what it felt like to be human." He walked around the desk, closing the distance between them. Eleanor tried to step back, but she was trapped between the steel cabinets and his overwhelming presence. He reached out, his hands framing her face. His touch was warm, possessive, and despite her rage, she felt that traitorous surge of electricity. "You were the only thing in this city that wasn't for sale," Arthur murmured, his eyes locking onto hers. "I watched you for years, Elena. I watched you fight for a man who didn't deserve you. I watched you stay pure in a city of filth. And I decided that if anyone was going to own your future, it was going to be me." "I am not a piece of property, Arthur," she breathed, her heart racing. "Aren't you?" he whispered, his face inches from hers. He leaned down, his lips grazing the shell of her ear. "I cleared your debts. I clothed you in silk. I put diamonds around your neck. And last night you gave yourself to me in a way that had nothing to do with money." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. The intensity of his gaze was suffocating. He wasn't apologizing. He was claiming her. He moved his hand from her face down to her throat, his thumb tracing the frantic beat of her pulse. "You're angry because I took away your choice," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate growl. "But look at yourself, Elena. You're more alive in this basement than you ever were in that library. You have fire in your blood, and that fire belongs to me." He kissed her then, a hard, punishing kiss that tasted of ownership and secrets. Elena fought him for a split second, her hands pushing against his chest, but the heat of his skin and the sheer magnetic pull of his power broke her resolve. She melted against him, her fingers tangling in his hair, her body responding to his with a desperate, hungry urgency that defied logic. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it had morphed into something else, a dark, shared understanding. They were both monsters in their own way. He was the predator who had stalked her, and she was the woman who had found her home in his shadow. Arthur pulled away, his breathing heavy. He looked down at the folder on the desk, then back at her. "There is one more thing you should know," he said, his expression darkening. "Your father didn't just owe money to the street thugs. He owed it to me. I was the one who authorized the hit on your apartment door 3 years ago. I needed to see if you would break." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "You put me through that for a test, and you passed," he said simply. He took her hand, interlacing his fingers with hers. "Now, come back upstairs. The world is waking up, and I have a lieutenant waiting for me. We have a leak to find, and I can't do it with you hiding in the dark." As they walked back up the stone stairs, Eleanor looked at the man beside her. He was a liar, a manipulator, and a cold-blooded killer. He had dismantled her life piece by piece, just to rebuild it in his image. Yet as they reached the warmth of his bedroom and the heavy tapestry fell back into place, she realized she didn't want to leave. She was bound to him by a web of secrets that went far deeper than she had ever imagined. But as Arthur dressed for his meeting, his face returning to its impenetrable mask, a new thought took root in Elena's mind. If he could manipulate her life so easily, who else was he manipulating? And in a house built on such profound deception, how could she ever know who was truly on her side? The loop was open. Suspicion had been planted, and as the morning sun began to hit the grey stones of the manor, the first signs of a greater betrayal began to stir in the shadows of Arthur Vane's empire. June 15th, 2021. The air inside the manor had turned stagnant, a heavy, silent pressure that seemed to vibrate with unspoken accusations. For 11 days since the revelation in the secret room, Elena had walked through the hallways like a ghost haunting her own life. She was no longer just the nanny. She was a woman caught in a web of silk and steel, bound to a man who had orchestrated her father's downfall as a test of her worth. Arthur had become a phantom. He spent his days and nights in the basement or behind the heavy oak doors of his office, his presence marked only by the smell of expensive tobacco and the low, urgent murmurs of men who looked like they were preparing for a siege. When he did see her, his gaze was no longer just hungry. It was clinical, searching her face for a trace of a lie he hadn't yet uncovered. The morning was grey and oppressive. Eleanor was in the nursery, watching Leo paint. The boy had started using colours other than black and blue, splashes of vibrant yellow and deep red, a sign that his world was slowly expanding beyond the trauma. But even as the boy healed, the house around him was decaying. A sharp, rhythmic pounding at the door startled them both. It wasn't a knock, it was a summons. Tommy, Arthur's most trusted lieutenant, stepped inside. His face was a mask of grim professionalism, but his eyes were darting toward the windows. Tommy had been with Arthur since they were teenagers in the back streets of East London, a man whose loyalty had never been questioned. "He wants you downstairs," Tommy said, his voice tight. "Now." "Is something wrong?" Elena asked, standing up and placing a protective hand on Leo's shoulder. "Just come," Tommy replied, avoiding her gaze. She followed him to the library, where Arthur was standing by the fireplace, staring into the flames. He was dressed in a dark navy suit that made his eyes look like the deep, cold Atlantic. On the desk lay a tablet showing a map of the estate, dotted with red markers that were moving steadily closer to the perimeter. "Leave us, Tommy," Arthur commanded without turning around. The door clicked shut, leaving Elena alone with the man who held her fate in his hands. The silence was a physical weight, stretching until it felt like it would snap. "6 months ago, I moved my brother's assets into a hidden offshore account," Arthur said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Only 3 people in this world knew the access codes: me, Tommy, and the person who handled the transfer." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "This morning those accounts were emptied, and an hour later the Moretti syndicate sent a message to my secure line. They knew the exact location of the safe house we were planning to move Leo to next week. The only place I wrote that location down was in a file in the basement room." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. "Arthur, you can't think—" "I found you in that room, Elena," he interrupted, taking a slow, predatory step toward her. "I found you looking through files you were never meant to see. You told me you were angry. You told me you felt like a piece of property." "I was angry," she cried, her voice cracking, "but I didn't steal from you. And I would never, ever put Leo in danger. You know that." Arthur didn't stop until he was inches away from her. He reached out, his hand wrapping around the back of her neck, his thumb pressing against the sensitive skin beneath her ear. The touch was possessive, a claim that felt like an interrogation. He pulled her flush against him, the hard planes of his body an unyielding wall. "Do I know that?" he whispered, his breath warm against her lips. "I know that you're smart. I know that you're desperate. And I know that I've given you every reason to hate me." He tilted her head back, his eyes searching hers with a desperate, tortured intensity. For a second, the mask of the kingpin slipped, and she saw the man who was terrified of losing the only thing that made him feel human. He leaned down, his mouth crashing against hers in a kiss that was raw, punishing, and fueled by a volatile mixture of desire and distrust. It was a collision of souls. Elena fought him for a heartbeat, her hands pushing against his chest, before she surrendered to the dark, magnetic pull. She kissed him back with a ferocity that spoke of her own hurt and her own undeniable connection to him. In the shadows of the library, they were 2 people drowning in a sea of their own making, clutching at each other as if they were the only life rafts in sight. Arthur pulled away, his breathing ragged. He kept his hand on her neck, his eyes never leaving hers. "The Morettis are at the gates, Elena. They've breached the outer wall. We have 10 minutes before this house becomes a battlefield. Then we need to get Leo," she said, her voice steadying. "If you think I'm the mole, kill me now, but don't let them take that boy." Arthur stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. The sound of a distant explosion echoed through the manor, rattling the windows. The alarm system began to wail, a high-pitched mechanical scream that signaled the end of the piece. "If you betrayed me, Elena," Arthur whispered, his voice like a blade, "I will be the last thing you ever see. But for now, you're the only person I can trust to keep him alive." He released her and pulled a weapon from his holster. "Tommy is waiting at the back entrance with an armored SUV. I'll hold them here while you get Leo to the car." "Arthur, no," she said, reaching for his arm. "Come with us." "I can't," he said, his face hardening into the mask of the monster. "If I don't stay, they won't stop until they find you. I have to finish this." Eleanor hurried to the nursery, her heart hammering against her ribs. She grabbed Leo, who was staring at the door with wide, terrified eyes. She didn't explain, she just scooped him up and ran. The hallways were no longer silent. They were filled with the sound of shouting and the rhythmic thud of heavy boots. She reached the back entrance where Tommy was waiting, his gun drawn. He looked pale, his hands shaking slightly, a detail Eleanor noticed only in passing. He hurried them into the back of the SUV, the heavy armor of the door thudding shut with a finality that felt like a tomb. "Where's the boss?" Tommy asked, looking at the manor. "He's staying," Elena said, her eyes fixed on the house. As the SUV sped away from the estate, Elena looked through the tinted rear window. She saw the flash of gunfire in the upper windows of the library. She saw the silhouettes of men moving through the smoke. And then she saw something that made her heart stop. Tommy wasn't looking at the road. He was looking at a burner phone in his lap, his thumb flying across the screen. "Tommy," she whispered. He didn't look back. "Don't worry, Elena. We're almost at the new safe house. Everything is going to be fine." But as they turned onto a dark, wooded road far from the city, Elena realized the truth. The file in the basement hadn't been the only way to find the safe house. Arthur had trusted Tommy with his life, his codes, and his family. The leak wasn't her. It was the only man Arthur had left to trust. The SUV slowed as it approached a set of iron gates that looked exactly like the ones they had just left. But these weren't Vane gates. They were marked with the crest of the Moretti Syndicate. The loop was open. The betrayal was complete. And as the car came to a halt, Elena realized that she and Leo were no longer being protected. They were being delivered. June 20th, 2021. The iron gates of the Moretti compound were far more sinister than the ones at the Vane Manor. They were topped with jagged spikes that looked like rows of obsidian teeth, and the security detail at the entrance was armed with submachine guns that caught the moonlight in a way that made Elena's stomach twist into a cold, hard knot. The SUV rolled to a stop inside a gravel courtyard, surrounded by high concrete walls and the oppressive silence of a trap finally closing. Tommy didn't look at her as he turned off the engine. The silence in the car was deafening, broken only by the rapid, shallow breathing of Leo, who had burrowed his face into Elena's side. "Why, Tommy?" Elena asked, her voice a hollow whisper. "He treated you like a brother." Tommy finally turned, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light of the dashboard. He looked older, the lines of his face etched with a bitter, simmering resentment. "Brothers don't keep their siblings in the dirt while they build empires of gold, Elena. Arthur thinks he's a king, but he's just a man who forgot where he came from. Moretti offered me a seat at the table. Arthur only ever offered me the crumbs." He reached over the seat, his hand hovering near Eleanor's face. She flinched, pulling Leo closer. Tommy's eyes flashed with a momentary regret before hardening into cold steel. "Get out of the car. If you make a sound, the boy pays for it first." The Moretti estate was a brutalist nightmare, all sharp angles, cold concrete, and expansive glass that offered no privacy, only the illusion of transparency. Elena was led through a series of sterile hallways to a room that was clearly a holding cell disguised as a guest suite. It was windowless, lit by a buzzing fluorescent light that made her head ache. Luca Moretti was waiting for them. He was dressed in a silk robe, a glass of dark wine in his hand, looking every bit the bored aristocrat. He smiled when he saw Elena, a slow, oily expression that made her skin crawl. "The nanny," he mused, walking toward her. He reached out and traced the line of her jaw with a cold, ring-adorned finger. "You look much better without the diamonds, Elena. More accessible." "Where is Arthur?" she spat, pulling away from his touch. Luca laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Arthur is currently presiding over a bonfire. My men were instructed to leave nothing standing. By now the Vane Manor is a pile of ash, and your protector is likely a charcoal remains in the library." Eleanor felt a wave of nausea, but she refused to break. She looked at Leo, who was staring at Luca with a terrifying, blank intensity. The boy's silence was no longer a retreat, it was a weapon. "He's not dead," Elena said, her voice ringing with a conviction she didn't know she possessed. "You don't know him like I do. You think you've won because you have his money and his man, but you haven't seen what he does when he has nothing left to lose." Luca's smile faded, replaced by a dark, jagged anger. He grabbed her arm, his grip bruisingly tight, and pulled her toward him. The smell of his expensive cologne was suffocating. "He has nothing, Eleanor, and soon neither will you." He shoved her into the room and locked the door. The sound of the heavy bolt sliding into place felt like a death sentence. 2 days passed in a blur of grey light and meagre meals. Elena spent every waking second with Leo, whispering stories to him, trying to keep the darkness at bay. But on the 3rd night, the world changed. It started with a sound, a low, rhythmic thud that vibrated through the concrete floor. Then came the screams. Elena pressed her ear to the door. Outside, the orderly silence of the compound had been replaced by the chaotic symphony of war. Gunshots echoed through the hallways, not the muffled puffs of silencers, but the roar of heavy-caliber weapons. An explosion rocked the building, throwing Elena and Leo to the floor. "He's here," Leo whispered. Elena froze. It was the first time she had heard the boy speak in months. His voice was small, raspy, but it carried a weight that made her heart soar. She grabbed his hands, her eyes searching his. "What did you say, Leo?" "Uncle Arthur," the boy said, his eyes bright with a fierce, sudden life. "He's coming for us." The door to the room didn't open. It was blown off its hinges. The force of the blast sent a cloud of dust and debris into the room. Elena shielded Leo with her body, her eyes stinging. When the smoke cleared, a silhouette stood in the doorway. It was Arthur. He looked like a nightmare brought to life. His suit was torn, his face was smeared with soot and blood, and his eyes were burning with a primal, terrifying light. He held a tactical shotgun in one hand, the barrel still smoking. He looked at Elena, and for a split second, the monster vanished, replaced by a man who had walked through hell to find his heart. "Get down!" he roared. A Moretti guard appeared in the hallway behind him. Arthur didn't even turn. He fired blindly over his shoulder, the blast throwing the man back against the far wall. Arthur stepped into the room, his movements fluid and lethal. He dropped the shotgun and pulled Elena into a crushing, desperate embrace. The heat of him was staggering. He smelled of gunpowder, sweat, and the rain of fire he had brought with him. He buried his face in her neck, his body vibrating with the adrenaline of the slaughter. "I thought I lost you," he groaned, his voice a jagged rasp. "You're hurt," Eleanor breathed, her fingers finding a deep gash on his shoulder. "It doesn't matter," he said, pulling back to look at her. He reached down and scooped Leo up with his other arm, the boy clinging to him like a lifeline. "We have to go. The compound is rigged. I didn't come here to negotiate. I came here to erase them." They ran through the crumbling hallways, the air thick with smoke and the smell of ozone. Arthur moved with a terrifying efficiency, clearing a path through the remnants of the Moretti security team. They reached the courtyard just as the first of the secondary explosions began to rip through the main building. A black SUV, identical to the one Tommy had used to betray them, was waiting at the gate. But this time, the driver was someone Elena didn't recognize, a man with a scarred face who looked even more dangerous than Arthur. As they neared the vehicle, a figure stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. It was Tommy. He was wounded, holding his side, his face a mask of desperation. He raised his weapon, his hand trembling. "Arthur, wait!" Tommy cried. Arthur didn't wait. He didn't hesitate. He stepped in front of Elena and Leo, shielding them with his own body. But before he could fire, Elena saw a flash of movement. Tommy wasn't aiming at Arthur. He was aiming at a Moretti sniper who had appeared on the roof above them. Tommy fired, the sniper falling into the darkness. But at the same moment, a burst of gunfire from the rooftop caught Tommy in the chest. The traitor fell to the gravel, his eyes wide and vacant. Arthur stared at his old friend for a heartbeat, a flicker of something, grief perhaps, crossing his face before it was replaced by the cold mask of survival. He ushered Eleanor and Leo into the SUV. "Drive," Arthur commanded. As the vehicle roared away from the compound, Elena looked back. A massive explosion lit up the night sky, a pillar of fire that turned the London mist into a glowing shroud. The Moretti Empire was burning, and with it, the last remnants of the life Arthur had once known. They drove for hours, leaving the city far behind. The tension in the car was thick, a heavy, silent weight. Arthur sat in the back with them, his hand gripping Elena's so tightly it was almost painful. He didn't speak. He just watched the road, his eyes reflecting the flickering lights of the dashboard. Finally, they pulled onto a narrow wooded track that led to a small, isolated cottage overlooking the coast. The air here was salt-tinged and clean, a world away from the blood and ash of the city. Arthur helped them out of the car. He looked at the cottage, then at Elena. His face was pale, the adrenaline finally beginning to fade, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. "We're safe here," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "For now." Eleanor looked at him, seeing the blood on his hands and the fire still lingering in his eyes. She realized then that they would never truly be safe. They were survivors of a war that had no end, bound together by a love that had been forged in the dark. But as she led Leo toward the cottage, she heard a sound from the trees, a soft, rhythmic clicking that didn't belong in the woods. Arthur froze, his hand moving toward his holster. The loop was open. They were alone in the wild, but the ghosts of London had a long reach. June 22nd, 2021. The clicking sound from the tree line was the sharp, metallic snap of a rifle bolt being slid into place. Arthur didn't hesitate. Despite the exhaustion weighing down his limbs and the blood soaking through his charcoal suit, he shoved Elena and Leo toward the porch of the cottage. He spun around, his own weapon raised in a single, fluid motion that defied the gravity of his injuries. A shadow moved within the pines, a lone tracker, a remnant of the Moretti guard who had followed the scent of blood all the way from the burning compound. The silence of the coast was shattered by a single deafening crack. Arthur fired once. The figure in the woods slumped into the high grass, the threat extinguished before it could even draw breath. Arthur stood still for a long moment, the sea breeze tossing his dark hair, his chest heaving. The adrenaline that had carried him through the rain of fire was finally deserting him. He swayed on his feet, the shotgun slipping from his grip and clattering against the wooden deck. "Arthur!" Elena cried, catching him before his knees hit the boards. She guided him inside the cottage. The interior was simple: weathered wood, a stone fireplace, and furniture that smelled of salt and aged pine. It was a sanctuary of the most basic kind. She settled Leo into a small armchair by the hearth, giving him a moth-eaten wool blanket to wrap around his shoulders. The boy was silent again, his eyes fixed on Arthur with a mixture of awe and terror. Eleanor turned her attention to the man who had burned an empire to save her. She helped him onto the long leather sofa. His face was a ghostly shade of grey, the sweat on his brow shimmering in the moonlight. She reached for his jacket, her fingers trembling as she peeled the blood-slicked material away from his skin. His shoulder was a mess of torn flesh and jagged edges, a deep furrow where a bullet had grazed him during the escape. Below that, his ribs were bruised a deep, sickly purple. "I need to clean this," Elena whispered, her voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. She found a first aid kit in the kitchen and a bottle of clear spirits. When she returned, she knelt between his legs, her movements focused and deliberate. She began to bathe the wound. Arthur hissed, his head snapping back against the leather, his large hands gripping the cushions so hard the seams groaned. "Focus on me, Arthur," she murmured, her face inches from his. As the sting of the alcohol faded, a different kind of intensity took hold in the small room. Eleanor's hands moved with a strange, heavy grace. She washed the soot from his chest, her fingers tracing the hard planes of his muscles, the jagged scars of his past, and the fresh, angry marks of his present. Each touch was an intimate map of his survival. The heat radiating from his body was staggering. Arthur looked down at her, his blue eyes dark with a hunger that had nothing to do with violence. He reached out with his good arm, his fingers tangling in the dark, salt-crusted waves of her hair. He pulled her closer, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip until she was breathless. "You should have left," he rasped, his voice a low, jagged vibration. "You saw what happens when I lose control. You saw the blood." "I saw a man who wouldn't let the world take what he loves," Elena countered, her hazel eyes fierce. She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. "You think you're a monster, Arthur, but a monster wouldn't have come back for me. A monster wouldn't look at this boy the way you do." She pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the scar on his chest, her lips warm against his skin. The contact was electric, a slow-burning fuse that ignited the air between them. Arthur groaned, his hand sliding down to the nape of her neck, pulling her into a kiss that tasted of iron and desperate, unyielding passion. The intimacy was quiet, profound, and utterly consuming. In the isolation of the coastal cottage, the titles of Nanny and Gangster were stripped away, leaving only two souls who had found a home in the middle of a war zone. Elena felt the roughness of his palms against her waist, the possessive weight of his body as he drew her into his space. The contact was detailed, the friction of their skin creating a fever that seemed to push back the cold shadows of the night. For the first time since she had arrived at the Vane Manor, the fear was gone, replaced by a deep visceral certainty. She belonged here, in the arms of this broken, powerful man. Later that night, the fire in the hearth was a low, amber glow. Leo was asleep in the armchair, his breathing steady for the first time in months. Elena lay in Arthur's arms on the sofa, her head resting on his uninjured shoulder. The sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs below was a rhythmic, grounding pulse. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Arthur looked out at the dark horizon. The exhaustion was still there, but his eyes were sharp again, the mind of the strategist never truly at rest. "Moretti is dead, but his lieutenants will be looking for blood. The accounts Tommy drained were just the beginning. I have one move left, Elena. A final gamble to ensure they never come for us again." He looked down at her, his expression softening into something so tender it made her heart ache. "I need to go back to the city, one last time." "No," Elena said, her grip on his arm tightening. "You can't. You're hurt." "I have to," Arthur said, his voice a low iron vow. "I won't have you and Leo looking over your shoulders for the rest of your lives. I'll end it where it started. And then, I'm coming back to you. I'm coming back to this." He leaned down and kissed her again, a promise made in the quiet of the safe house, a vow that carried the weight of everything they had sacrificed. As the first light of dawn began to touch the sea, Elena watched Arthur stand. He moved with a stiff, pained grace, reaching for his weapon and his resolve. The loop was open once more. The peace of the cottage was a fragile thing, a temporary sanctuary before the final confrontation. She watched him walk toward the door, her heart heavy with the realization that the man who had burned London to save her was now going back to face the ashes alone. But as he looked back at her one last time, she saw the fire in his eyes, the fire of a man who finally had something worth living for. The final gamble was about to begin. June 24th, 2021. The drive back into London was a descent into a familiar hell. Arthur sat in the back of the armoured sedan, his gaze fixed on the grey, rain-slicked pavement of the motorway. Every bump in the road sent a jolt of white-hot pain through his shattered shoulder, but he welcomed the sensation. It was a grounding force, a reminder of the price he had already paid and the debt he was about to collect. The city greeted him with its usual indifference. The neon signs of Piccadilly Circus blurred into streaks of garish light, and the towering glass monoliths of the city stood like silent witnesses to the violence that pulsed beneath their foundations. For 20 years, Arthur had been a part of that pulse, a man who understood the rhythm of the shadows. But tonight he wasn't looking to lead the dance, he was looking to end it. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a burner phone. He dialed a number he hadn't used in 3 years, the direct line to the broker, a man who sat in the neutral space between the syndicates, a dealer in information and ultimate leverage. "The Moretti line is broken," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The lieutenants are fighting over the scraps. By midnight they'll turn London into a slaughterhouse. I'm giving you the access codes to the offshore accounts Tommy stole. I want a meeting with the remaining heads, in the open. At the Guildhall." "You're a dead man if you walk in there, Vane," the broker replied, his voice tinny and devoid of emotion. "I'm already a ghost," Arthur countered. "Just make the call." While Arthur navigated the lethal politics of the city, 90 miles away, the coastal cottage was a sanctuary of agonizing stillness. Elena stood by the window, her fingers tracing the condensation on the glass. The sea was a churning mass of slate-grey water, mirroring the storm of anxiety in her chest. Leo was sitting on the floor, playing with a set of smooth river stones Elena had found on the beach. He hadn't spoken since that frantic moment in the Moretti compound, but there was a new alertness in his eyes, a sense that he was no longer waiting for a blow to fall. He was waiting for his uncle. Elena felt a strange, hollow ache in the center of her being. She remembered the heat of Arthur's skin against hers in the firelight, the way his voice had broken when he whispered her name. She had spent her whole life running from men who were weak, men who folded under the weight of their own choices. But Arthur was different. He carried the weight of the world on his scarred shoulders, and he did it for her. She walked to the small table and picked up a silver locket Arthur had left for her. Inside was a small piece of paper with a series of numbers, a bank account that would ensure she and Leo would never want for anything, even if he didn't return. "I don't want the money, Arthur," she whispered to the empty room. "I want the man." In London, the Guildhall was a cathedral of ancient power and modern corruption. Arthur walked through the massive oak doors at 11 in the evening. He was alone, unarmed, at least in the traditional sense. He wore a clean black suit, the sling for his arm hidden beneath the jacket. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, but he walked with the steady, iron-willed gait of a man who had already accepted his fate. The 5 remaining lieutenants of the Moretti syndicate were waiting for him in the great hall, surrounded by the statues of kings and the silence of centuries. They were flanked by their own security details, a forest of dark suits and hidden weapons. "You have a lot of nerve coming here, Vane," one of the men said, a scarred individual named Marco who had always been the most aggressive of the lot. "We should kill you for what you did to the Moretti compound." "You could," Arthur said, stopping 10 feet away from them. He didn't look at their guns, he looked at their faces. "But if I don't check in with a specific server by 1 in the morning, the files I gave the broker will be released to the Metropolitan Police, the National Crime Agency, and every rival syndicate in Europe. Those files contain the bank records, the shipping manifests, and the names of every crooked politician on your payroll." The room went deathly silent. The lieutenants exchanged looks of pure, unadulterated terror. Arthur wasn't just threatening their lives, he was threatening their existence. "What do you want?" Marco spat. "A ceasefire," Arthur said. "You keep the Moretti territories, you keep the docks, but the Vane name is erased. You never look for me, you never look for the boy, and you never ever look for the woman. If a single person even whispers her name in a Soho basement, the files go live. How do we know we can trust you?" "You don't," Arthur replied, a cold, jagged smile playing on his lips. "But I'm the only one standing between you and a life sentence in Belmarsh. Take the deal, or we all burn together." It was the ultimate gamble. Arthur was betting on their greed and their fear, the 2 things he understood better than anyone. He watched the realization dawn on their faces. They were businessmen at heart, and Arthur had just made them an offer they couldn't refuse. "The deal is done," Marco said, gesturing for his men to lower their weapons. "But if we ever see your face in London again, Vane, there won't be a second meeting." Arthur didn't wait for a handshake. He turned and walked out of the Guildhall, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had won. He had secured a future for Eleanor and Leo, with nothing but a bluff and the weight of his own reputation. As he stepped out into the rain, he felt the adrenaline finally begin to drain away. He leaned against the stone wall of the building, his breathing shallow. He was tired, tired of the blood, tired of the lies, and tired of the shadows. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't call the broker. He didn't call his men. He dialed the number for the cottage. The phone rang 3 times before Eleanor picked up. "Arthur," she breathed, her voice a fragile thread of hope. "It's over, Elena," he said, his voice cracking with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. "The debt is paid, the war is finished. Where are you?" "I'm standing in the rain in the middle of a city that doesn't want me anymore," he replied. "I'm coming home." He hung up and began the long walk toward the car that was waiting for him at the end of the street. He felt like a different man, a man who was no longer defined by what he took, but by what he had managed to keep. But as he approached the vehicle, a black car with tinted windows pulled up alongside him. The back door opened, and for a split second Arthur felt the old instinct to reach for a weapon. But he stopped. A man he hadn't seen in years, a retired detective who had once been his father's greatest rival, stepped out. He looked at Arthur with a mixture of respect and pity. "You did a brave thing tonight, Arthur," the man said, "but be careful. The shadows in this city have a way of following you, even when you think you've walked into the light." Arthur nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm not afraid of the shadows anymore. I have a fire to go back to." He climbed into his car and watched the Guildhall disappear in the rearview mirror. He was moving toward a new horizon, toward a life he hadn't thought possible. The loop was closing. The gamble had paid off, but as the car sped toward the coast, Arthur couldn't help but feel that the true cost of his victory had yet to be fully realized. He was coming back to her, but he was bringing the scars of a lifetime with him. And as the first light of dawn began to touch the London skyline, he realized that the hardest part of his journey wasn't the war he had just won. It was the peace he was about to start. August 1st, 2021. The salt air of the coast was a different kind of silence than the one that had haunted the Vane Manor. This was a living, breathing quiet, punctuated by the rhythmic pulse of the Atlantic and the cry of gulls circling the jagged cliffs. For 5 weeks the cottage had been a world unto itself, a sanctuary where the ghosts of London were forbidden to enter. Elena stood on the porch, her hair damp from the morning mist, watching the sun rise over the horizon in a bruised palette of gold and violet. She wore a simple white linen dress that caught the breeze, her feet bare against the weathered wood. She looked different now. The sharp, defensive edges of her personality had softened, replaced by a grounded, quiet strength. She was no longer a woman running from a debt. She was a woman who had stood in the center of a storm and refused to be swept away. Inside, she heard the soft clinking of porcelain. Leo was sitting at the small wooden table, pouring milk into a bowl with a steady, confident hand. He was 7 years old now, and the silence that had once been his prison was gone. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his words were deliberate and full of life. "The tide is high today, Elena," Leo said, his voice small but clear. "It is," she replied, smiling at him through the open door. "Maybe we can find some new stones after breakfast." The sound of a car engine, a low, rhythmic rumble, echoed through the trees. It wasn't the aggressive roar of an armored SUV, it was a softer, older sound. Elena's heart skipped a beat, a familiar electric anticipation racing through her veins. A silver vintage sedan pulled into the gravel drive. Arthur stepped out, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. He was dressed in a simple grey sweater and dark trousers, his signature tuxedos and black shirts left behind in the ashes of the city. He moved with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of the night at the Moretti compound, and his shoulder was held at a stiff angle, but his eyes, once shards of blue ice, were now warm with a light that had been missing for decades. He stopped at the edge of the porch, looking up at her. The distance between them was only a few feet, but it represented a journey across 1,000 battlefields. "You're late," Eleanor said, her voice a whisper of a joke. "The bridge was closed," Arthur replied, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips, "and I had to make sure the shadows weren't following me." He walked up the steps, his presence filling her senses like a physical wave. He smelled of sea salt and the expensive cedarwood cologne she had grown to associate with safety. He reached out, his large, calloused hand cupping her cheek. The touch was slow, possessive, and devastatingly tender. Eleanor leaned into his palm, closing her eyes as the heat of him anchored her to the present. "Is it truly over?" she asked, looking deep into his eyes. "The war is over, Elena," Arthur said, his voice a low, iron vow. "The Vane name is a memory in London. The accounts are closed, and the men who wanted us dead are too afraid to even say our names. We are ghosts now, and ghosts are free to go wherever they want." He pulled her into his arms, his body a solid, unyielding wall of protection. Elena wrapped her arms around his waist, her fingers tracing the scars beneath his sweater. The intimacy between them was no longer fueled by the adrenaline of a kill. It was a slow, burning fire, a shared understanding of the cost of their survival. They had both been consumed by the darkness, and they had both emerged, transformed and scarred, into the light. Leo stepped out onto the porch, stopping beside Arthur. The man reached down and placed a heavy, grounding hand on the boy's shoulder. They didn't need words. The bond between them, forged in the fires of the Syndicate War, was a silent language of loyalty and love. "We have a lot to build, Arthur," Elena said, looking out at the vast, open sea. "We have time," he replied. "For the first time in my life, I don't have to look at the clock. I only have to look at you." They spent the morning on the beach, the three of them walking along the shoreline. The scars were there, Arthur's limp, Elena's occasional glance toward the tree line, Leo's quiet moments, but they were no longer the defines of their lives. They were the marks of a resilience that had seen them through the impossible. Arthur had gambled everything on a bluff in a London hall, and he had won. But the true victory wasn't the ceasefire or the offshore accounts. It was the way Elena looked at him in the sunlight. It was the way Leo called him uncle, without a trace of fear. It was the realization that even in a world built on blood and stone, it was possible to find a horizon that wasn't on fire. As the sun reached its zenith, casting a brilliant, blinding light over the Atlantic, Elena stood by the water's edge. She felt a profound sense of peace, a realization that the journey that had started with a desperate knock on a manor door had led her to exactly where she was meant to be. Resilience isn't just about surviving the storm, it's about having the courage to rebuild when the wind stops. They were the architects of their own redemption, and as Arthur walked toward her, his hand reaching out to hers, Eleanor knew that the new horizon wasn't just a place they had found. It was a life they had earned. The loop was closed. The nanny and the gangster were gone, replaced by a man and a woman who had chosen to walk into the light together. And as the waves washed away their footprints in the sand, the only thing that remained was the quiet, enduring power of a promise kept in the dark.